Today I'm going to teach you how to change a clutch on a 2003 Kia Rio.
Only problem is, I've never worked on a Kia before. Oh well, I guess I'll have to figure it out somehow.
Still barely dries. And we're toasty. Let's get to business. Well, first remove this gay cover. Next, now remove the air intake assembly and battery. That's done. Now I've unplugged a couple wires that are in my way. Now I've got access to the bolts around the perimeter. So next step is undo the ball joint clevis bolt so I can separate the ball joint and move the axle over, because soon the transmission will be moving this way. Now that the ball joint's separated and everything can move back and forth that way freely, you have to crawl underneath the vehicle, it's on my cardboards there, and remove the cross member that supports the motor and transmission, and at the same time find a jack that can support the motor and transmission without the cross member. So now I'm crawling underneath the car, and there's a manifold support bracket that has to be removed to get at the back bolt of the transmission that's above the passenger side axle. And that's this bracket here. It interferes with getting off one starter motor bolt and of course the 17mm transmission bolt. Got most of the bolts out to get this cross member off, but haven't got the jack under it yet, so that's why it's still sitting there. I've removed more bolts where the oil pan bolts to the transmission and to the exhaust bracket. Engine support cradle is off, and engine is supported by a jack and a block of wood going up on the oil pan. Now you can freely see the rest of the transmission. Next step is to get a little wedge in there and pop out the passenger side axle from the transmission so that when it's unbolted I can move the transmission that way. And of course put a bucket underneath because some gear oil will probably leak out. On a car like this I don't have to separate the ball joint and remove the axle from this side. I just leave it in the car, and then when I'm putting the transmission back on I slip the axle back in the hole. It saves one step, because that was a pain in the ass getting the C's ball joint clevis bolt out on the other side. And I don't remove the axle from the spindle on this side either. That's just an extra step I don't need to do. Now that the ball joint's unhooked, the whole the whole strut assembly and spindle will just move this way as the transmission pulls this way to get at the clutch. Now the transmission is just hanging on by one bolt I left there that's loose. Other than that, it's all flopping around. The speedometer sensor is still attached. Clutch cable is still attached. I may not need to remove those, but I will have to readjust the clutch, so I put oil on that little screw so it would be easier later on. The motor mount or transmission mount brackets are still attached to the transmission that were on the cross member. You can leave those on the transmission. Like I said, this is all floppy so the tranny can move this way. Now I have another jack set up so that when I take out that final bolt, I'll have this jack jacked up to support the transmission so it doesn't drop out. And the axle's popped out on the other side and I'm catching the oil that's running out. I'll leave the axle and the transmission on this side. It's not necessary to be removed. Now, of course, I'm under the car, and I did have to remove the wire for the reverse light switch. Now I have to lower both of my jacks so the transmission can come down enough to clear that opening on the side wall of the car so that the transmission can move enough out of the way when it separates from the engine. Now that everything is supported, the engine's lowered a bit crooked, I'll remove that final bolt. It's holding the tranny on. And there she be, and nothing fell. So there's two ways to get the tranny starting to come off. One is go back in the car and push the clutch, and that'll move the tranny over a bit. Two, get a screwdriver or a wedge in there or something and pry between the block and tranny with pounding in with a hammer. But now that it's supported, don't expect any great fall or anything. Everything will be fine. Well, a little push of the clutch just gave me a centimeter gap. So now I just have to reach over, grab the tranny, and see how far I can wiggle it back. On most of the jobs I do, I see if I can get the tranny far enough out of the way that I can slip the clutch and pressure plate and everything in and unbolt it and rebolt it without putting the tranny on the ground and unhooking the last few things. Saves a few steps, and it's kind of pain in the ass laying on your back holding up a tranny and getting it aligned. So, transmission is supported. A little prying. I do have enough room to rotate that flywheel, get all those bolts off that hold the pressure plate on. The rear axle is separated by a couple inches. Goes to that side of the car. And it looks like I can slip everything in there without removing the whole transmission. And I checked inside, and when I get that pressure plate off, there's enough room in there to get the clutch release bearing out too. So it should all work out. Sweet. So everything's unbolted. I'm slipping out the clutch friction disc, and it looks shot. One side's a lot thicker than the other side, and the rivets are definitely rubbing. Oh well. That'll just pull out the pressure plate. And that's slipping out no problem too. There we go. The surface of the flywheel looks excellent, so luckily I don't have to take it off and get it remachined. There's one disadvantage to remachining flywheels, is that when you get them back they have that rough machine texture on them. And I find clutches last about 20,000 more kilometers if you put them on a polished flywheel surface than on that rough surface, as it takes a long time for it to wear off and become polished. In this case, the rivets luckily only wore out the pressure plate, and since my kit is a new pressure plate, that doesn't matter. And there's the new parts. Won't be able to use this handy dandy clutch alignment tool because I didn't remove the transmission, so there's not enough room to get in there. But I have another way. When this is sitting on there, I can peek in from the side and just keep bumping it with a screwdriver while it's lightly tightened by fingers until, when I rotate the engine, I see an even space all the way around. Then I know it'll work. Sweet. To get the old clutch release bearing out, I had to remove the bolt that went in there on those release forks to get the arm to move over enough to slip this thing off the shaft. Now you can see that smooth shaft. I have to put a little bit of grease on it so this rides back and forth easily when it's releasing the clutch. And I put a little bit of grease on the spline shaft and smooth end to help everything slip in better when I'm re-putting the transmission back on. Now time to slip on the bearing. That slipped on really easy. Now just to put that bolt back in. Now I just randomly slip in the pressure plate, and then next I slip in the friction disc, making sure that the side that sticks out goes towards the pressure plate and not the flywheel. And then it'll sit on 3 dowel pins. Then I can put the bolts back in. And then I can slip my screwdriver in until I get that thing centered with this edge. And then evenly tighten it. And then hopefully the tranny just slips right back on lickety-split.